Okay. All right.
Oh, God.
Necesito ng interpretación. Talong bajo. Ito mo bajo.
So I did stage.
Bienvenida. Hi, I'm T. Iriarte Medina. Welcome to this panel. This is a very important discussion, so I'm so happy that you all joined us, especially after.
Turn the microphone on.
I thought it was on. Yeah. My apologies. We'll just turn it up.
Test.
Because it's close to the, it's gonna give a little feedback.
All right. That's not really doing much, is it?
As long as we don't get feedback.
All right.
Better?
Talk up.
Yeah, I think we'll have to talk loud, but you'll hear the Zoom speakers over the mic.
Good afternoon. I am Tyrese Iriarte Medina. I am happy that you all joined us today. We are a little short on time than we typically would be, so I want to make sure that we keep our remarks brief, but we also want to make sure that you're well informed, that you get the information you need while you're here, okay? I want to welcome our esteemed panelists. First of all, thank you for joining us to discuss this important topic. We stand in solidarity with our Cuban brothers and sisters. We acknowledge that as people of African descent, so many of our struggles are imbricated. Today, I thank you for joining us to envision a future where the criminal and inhumane blockade on Cuba no longer exists, where Cuba is no longer on the state sponsors of terrorism. This time, I want to introduce a very important person, Ambassador Yuri Dalla Lopez. I'll turn the floor over.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes.
Oh. Thank you for inviting us to this panel on behalf of the Permanent Mission of Cuba to the United Nations. Express our deep appreciation for that kind of invitation. And more importantly, for whole conference that you have organized for Saturday and Sunday. This is really a great undertaking, and we look forward to participating actively today and tomorrow. So thank you all. Let me also mention that for my mission and for my staff and the people represented here, obviously also an honor to be part of this panel. It's a very symbolic panel because of the theme we will be addressing. And on that note, let me also stress that we Cubans, part of our African roots, it should be recalled. I said,
I apologize so much. I just want to make sure everyone can hear you. And I just found someone that can fix the microphone here.
Good work.
Have a good loud voice anyways. Okay, all right. I apologize that the microphone for those in the room is not working very well here, but Luckily, we have very strong voices from our speakers here, so
Okay.
sorry for the
That's
interruption.
okay. Well, I was saying that we Cubans are proud of our African roots. It should be recalled decisive contribution, the formation of the Cuban nationality, more than 1,200,000 Africans who arrived in our country, Cuba, torn from their lands by the abhorrent slave trade, and whose presence marked the history of Cuba. Cuba's fraternal links with Africa are an essential part for history, cemented in deep cultural roots. We reaffirm that the special relations between Cuba and Africa we have built together over the years under the wise guidance brotherhood of the historic leaders of our nations are indestructible. Let me also mention that these ties were deepened during the heroic deeds of our people against colonialism and racism in African soil, as well as for the preservation, the sovereignty and territorial integrity of several nations in Africa. Now, it is not possible to speak about the links with Africa without mentioning the historic leader of the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro Ruz, who turned solidarity with other peoples into an important attribute of the revolution and taught that the struggle for social justice has no borders. Fidel always highlighted the duty that we Cubans, Africa, for the crucial role played by Africans and their descendants in the independence wars of our country, their contribution to the construction of our Caribbean nation. Since the triumph of the Cuban Revolution back in 1959, Cuba has practiced consistent internationalism, being loyal to its principles of solidarity towards its African brothers and sisters, and solidarity with Africa became a priority for Cuba. Let me highlight the broad and solid relations of friendship, solidarity, and cooperation built between Africa and Cuba since the deployment of the first Cuban medical mission in Algeria back in 1963 to the present. And on that note, let me also mention that Army General Raúl Castro Ruz once stated, and I quote, "Cuba, which carries African blood in its veins, emerged from the struggle for independence and for the abolition of slavery, and subsequently has had the privilege of fighting and building alongside African nations." End of quote. Over 380,000 Cubans went to Africa to help in the fight against colonialism and for the independence. More than 2,000 of them paid the supreme sacrifice of their lives. This month of March, we will be marking another anniversary of the victory in the Battle of Cuilo Valley, which became a milestone in the history and the political life of the continent, for its decisive contribution to the independence of Angola and Namibia and the overthrow of the racist apartheid regime in South Africa. The nation of the beloved and enduring Nelson Mandela, who is and will always be a symbol of honor and dignity of this continent. Throughout these years, hundreds of thousands of Cuban professionals have rendered their services in Africa in areas such as healthcare, education, construction, sport, agriculture, many others. African leaders and peoples who appreciate in Fidel the brother, the men who unconditionally promoted independence from colonialism and provided support for the social development of the people. Since the triumph of the Cuban Revolution, we have we have lent our unconditional support to Africa, not only along the national liberation process, but also in the training of human resources. In Cuba, more than 30,000 African students have graduated from various specialties, out of which more than 29,000 belong to the sub-Saharan African region. And there are many students from the African nations undergoing scholarships in Cuba as we speak. Bilateral cooperation between Cuba and African countries continue to strengthen and diversify. Today, we have cooperation projects in nearly all African countries. A number of Cuban professionals in various fields, such as health, education, sports, agriculture, provide their services in more than 30 African countries. Cuba has cooperated with Africa in the fight against disasters and diseases, including in the combat against epidemics such as Ebola, and more recently, against COVID-19, as you know. Brigades of the Henry Reed International Contingent have traveled to several African countries to help in the fight against the said pandemic. So Africa continues to be a priority for Cuba's foreign policy. Our relations with that continent are one of continuity, mutual benefit, and commitment to history. Africa is a decisive actor in international affairs. Its member states make up 1/3 of the United Nations General Assembly and have other forums of global consultation, such as the Non-Aligned Movement, the group of G77 and China. And let me recall that Cuba, this year, 2023, is the current chair of the group 77 plus China. We appreciate the unanimous support of the governments, leaders, organizations, and peoples of Africa in the struggle against the blockade imposed by the United States on Cuba, including during their vote in favor of the traditional support resolution approved by 30 years in a row, as you know, at the United General Assembly, as well as the adoption for a number of years of a resolution against the blockade within the African Union. We do value very much that long-standing and genuine solidarity, especially now when Cuba is facing the cruel impact of the longest and most comprehensive system of unilateral coercive measures in history ever applied against any country. Cuba continues to renew its friendship and fraternity with the broader continent to which we are united by bonds of blood, culture, and history. Cuba has a prestige in Africa for its selfless contribution to the struggles for independence and sovereignty of African nations and in favor of development. Let me close by reaffirming an idea expressed by Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel, and I quote, "The relationship between Africa and Cuba is as profound as it is indestructible. It is in the very genesis of our nation," end of quote. And certainly, loyal to our historical and solidarity tradition, we will continue to enhance the friendly and cooperative ties with that continent in the best interest of our people. So let me end by reiterating that Africa can always count on Cuba. Thank you very much.
Very, very much your local ambassador.
Can't hear you. It's not working.
The shout.
My cheerleader voice. Thank you so much, Yuri, Ambassador Yuri. We appreciate you and your remarks. And we thank you for sharing that knowledge with us today. Yeah. Did here. Actually, hey, she's in Cuba, so we have a tech issue with the connection. Ever. Can you hear us? Ah, wonderful. This is T. Hello, hello. Puerto Rico.
Can't hear you.
Right, the energy over there. So right, at this moment, I want to introduce a very special person who's working on an amazing project with us, an oral histories project that discusses the historical context between Cuba and Africa. And she's a professor and dean at the School of Languages at the University of Havana. She's a coordinator in Cuba and Africa Oral History Project. It's Kenya Serrano. Can we all?
Hello.
Can't hear you.
all of you trying to help us with all this technological preparatory process. And of course, here we are, the Cuba and Africa Oral History team here in Havana. We have been organizing a few actions. First of all, I want to share a video with you. It's very short. Can you please play the video now for them to see? And probably I can comment during the screening of the video. What do you think?
Yes.
I'm gonna try and get the video up here, but I don't think I actually have it. So if you
Let me tell you, I don't want to waste my time. Just share the video when you are able to do so. And then, my friends, we are working in the continuity of the project Cuba in Africa. And first of all, I want to congratulate all of you, and especially our friend and comrade Negash Abdurrahman, because recently we have received the Thomas Sankara Prize in a very important festival. It's been said that it is the main cinema festival in all Africa, in Burkina Faso, Ouagadougou. And then it was a very special moment. I hope Negash is able to comment on that, of course, but I feel that we all are receiving a lot of support. Cuba, you, the Solidarity Movement, and the people from Africa, that in every city where Negash is able to go and participate, no matter if it is in Doha, Qatar, or in Dubai, or in Europe, or in any other place in the world, it's been received with a lot of attention, not only because of the awards, but also because of the nominations, and also because of the hearings, because of the audience response. I want to tell you that when Negash came to Havana last April 2022, we were able to go to 7 different provinces of Cuba, and a lot of people came to the screenings. A lot of Cubans started to tell us a lot of news stories we Cubans know about this, but as Negash always remember us, the world still doesn't know about this. And then we need to tell the stories of the Cubans that went to Africa to defeat apartheid and also to achieve the independence of Namibia and Angola, and also to guarantee the freedom for our brother, unforgettable brother, Nelson Mandela. So it was a huge contribution that our generations of Cubans, we did to the current situation of Africa, where millions of Africans are free thanks to their own efforts and the efforts of Cubans that went there. So we are receiving a lot of support from from ICAP, of course, from the Office of the Historian of Havana, from our university, the University of Havana. We are receiving a lot of support also from the Women's Federation. Our Communist Party is always supporting our actions here in Cuba. And we have been also creating the new interviews. We are interviewing new combatants, women and men, because we realized that there are a lot of voices, but we were like missing some women in this process. So we are interviewing more and more women in this phase of the project. We are also working with other institutions and local projects. In El Cotorro, for instance, we went with Ike and Erin when they came to Havana last January. I thank them again because of their contribution to our project. And I congratulate you all because of the success of this conference. And when we went to Cotorro, we went to see Isabel and Manresa, two of the internationalists that are part of Cuba in Africa, the short documentary. And now they are part of a new project in El Cotorro, in Santa Maria del Rosario, a small town. They are dehydrating food. They have a project, a local project on their own. It is something that they created, and they are also training people that is in their community to learn how to do that. They also work with women that are living in a provisional community. You know that in Cuba, because of the problem we have with housing, a lot of Cubans, when their houses are damaged, they have to move to a provisional house outside Havana sometimes. And there in Santa Maria del Cotorro, there is a community where we have this kind of provisional houses. So a lot of women there, they are working thanks to these local projects. We are also working with the Cuban Women's Federation in order to do some training sessions against some of the problems, the social problems that we have there in Santa Maria del Rosario, and of course in many other vulnerable communities here in Cuba, in Havana, like Noemi, the first deputy president of ICAP, already said a few minutes ago. We are focusing together with the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, where our brother Gerardo Hernandez is the leader of this movement in Cuba, the massive organization of all Cubans, the CDRs, and of course our government, the local government and the state in general. We are working with the vulnerable communities, and there we can find the internationalists doing a lot of things. So my conclusion was, they were heroes when they returned from Africa, but they didn't stop doing things. They continue sharing their knowledge, sharing their values, sharing their experiences as revolutionaries with other people that really need those experiences here in Cuba, in our communities. At the University of Havana, we have had a very important privilege to have our friend, the scholar activist, Rosemary Milley. She has been to my faculty, the faculty that I'm the dean right now. We are practicing different languages, especially we encourage our students to practice English, but not in all topics, general topics. I always encourage my students to practice English by reading African literature. Especially we have one of our postgraduate courses has to do with African literature written by women, and Rosemary Milley also joined us for that course. and for revisiting the historical encounter between Fidel and Malcolm X. You know that Rosmi has been paramount in promoting the historical moments where Fidel and Malcolm met. But we always say that it didn't stop back there in the 60s. Nowadays, we have to continue telling the new generations about the importance of that meeting, about the importance and the incidence of Malcolm X in Fidel's anti-racist ideology, and also vice versa, the relation between Fidel and Malcolm. And because of that, we are calling an international seminar in Havana by the end of May and by the beginning of June, June the 1st and 2nd, about Fidel, Malcolm, and Lucius Walker and their contribution to the anti-racist movement in the world. So I'm very proud of being part of this project, Cuba in Africa Oral History Project. We are doing a lot of things. We are working with people here in Havana. We are working with people here in El Cotorro municipality. We also did a workshop already in Matanzas with the people there in Matanzas with different movements that are really willing to know and really willing to understand what we can do in order to preserve our historical memory, and also how to give voice to people that, of course, they haven't been visible for many others, and we need them to be really recognized in their communities. I had, by the end of my presentation now, sorry if I'm talking a little long, but it is my last idea. I had a very interesting experience during COVID times. I was a leader of a project in Havana Vieja, in my municipality where I live. We went to the houses of the people that is receiving attention from a project organized by Fidel, that it is the El Sistema de Atención a la Familia. It is the system to feed some families that they are in risk. And then during COVID times, a lot of third age people were not able to come to these dining rooms because they were isolated in their houses. So at the University of Havana, we organized a lot of teams in Havana, and I was in charge of the team that went to their houses in Havana Vieja. We found many of them that were really alone without a person taking care of them. And then our conclusion was that, of course, we have to take care of these people. We have to feed them. We have to give them conditions, housing, but also we have to pay attention to their spirituality. The way that the Cuban society continues the socialist values and the solidarity that we practice all over, it is to take care of ourselves, to take care of our third age population, that they are the protagonists of many, many amazing pages of our recent history. So as Cuba in Africa, we are very motivated. We are like networking and doing a lot of things for the local development. It is our priority. And I thank the different organizations. I mentioned ICAP, the FMC, I mentioned the Office of the Historian, the Combatants Association. Of course, I have to mention our university, the University of Havana, that is giving us a lot of support. And of course, you, our friends in the United States and Canada. I thank Rosemary Milley. I thank also our friends Ike and Erin, Gail Walker, that is always supporting us in many ways. And of course, Dolimar T, that she came to Havana last January 27th, and she accompanied us together with the combatants of the revolution. And she was a witness of a moment where a lot of teenagers participated at the screening of Cuba in Africa, the documentary, and they were crying. They were really moved by the story that we tell via Cuba in Africa. So it is important, and I can tell you that now is the time to really go and defeat the blockade from inside Cuba and from outside Cuba. I thank you all for everything you do. Thank you.
Now is the time. Now is it?
Well, can you have like a little bit of a problem? We started almost an hour later for because some of our earlier remarks.
How are you doing, mate?
Shared. Yeah. Hopefully.
Are you?
Yes, Kenya, how long is the video?
3
3 minutes, okay.
3 minutes. ¿Lo pueden ver?
Hang in there, family. Hang in there with us.
You need to make it full screen.
You hear that music without thinking of.
Yeah, we're not seeing the video.
No. No. Pregúntale si ya lo puede reproducir. Can you? Okay.
We can
So
put it up on the
sorry.
website, Kenya.
Thank you so much.
You know what, Kenya, we can put it up on the website and then everybody can view it on the website because everybody has the website. Fine, it's fine. Yeah. Gracias, Kenya. Ahora sí.
Kenya, are you gonna stay for the rest of the webinar? Nope.
Stage left.
That's enough there. All right, I think we're back up.
Well, Kenya kind of gave us a prelude and some really good information about Cuba and Africa, the documentary. And I'm not sure if you were able to hear all her remarks, but Cuba and Africa is a new documentary. And if you do have a cell phone, I would like to share the link with you right now so you can see the documentary trailer, your free time. But it's cubaandafrica.com. Very simple. And I want all of you to engage with it as much as you can, because I am working with them on the oral histories project in order to bring it to a city, hopefully where you can get the full screening. It's a very compelling and emotional documentary, but I think we all need to learn about that history. We all need to know the ways in which we can continue to support the struggle in solidarity with Africa and Cuba. So at this time, I'm going to actually introduce the filmmaker. His name is Nagash. I'm looking for imaginary mouth.
I'll switch the focus to him.
He's joining us live stream as well.
He's here.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Great to be here. I'm Nagash. I'm the producer and director of Cuba and Africa, coming to you directly from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia now. It's almost midnight here. But I want to thank the people who organized this conference. This is a very complex technical undertaking, also doing it live and streaming it. I'm just really grateful that our little film has given the glimpse of what Cuba has done. We are not able to tell the entire story, but this little island nation, what it did for Africa. You know, today, by my estimate, at least 90 million people in Southern Africa are free of colonialism and apartheid because of Cuba's heavy contribution to this. And I'm especially gratified that African people are getting to see this story. The young people do not know a lot of this story. Even the old people have forgotten it. So when in Burkina Faso, exactly a week ago, we had an outdoor screening, an amphitheater, and outdoors. Most of the attendees were young people, and I was very, very happy to see young people understanding this history, appreciating who stood by the side of Africans. So I am really grateful of that. You know, this story's gotten a wider circulation, and I'm also just, you know, as somebody born and raised in Africa, I feel I always felt duty bound once I understood this story that we need to be, at least the least we can do is say thank you to Cuba, because nobody has done what Cuba has done for Africa. And from my experience, Cuba is the one country that does not run away from being Black, being African. Everybody's trying to get away from that. And it's a big deal. And Africans really, people were in tears. And when they saw this, and it's their story, it's Cuba's story, and Cuba today is being punished for what it did for Africa. We're standing against colonialism and against racism. The Cuban people are being made to pay heavy price. So we all need to keep in mind. And finally, what I would say is I was not, until I started working on this film, a traditional supporter of Cuba. Working on this project allowed me to come into contact with many of you long-term friends of Cuba. And I want to tell you what you're doing is very, very important. Really, I did not appreciate that as an outsider before. And Cuba has a lot of friends. We should not let it be isolated. And it stood on the right side of history at very difficult moments. And finally, I want to thank all the friends who helped me with this project, especially Aaron and Ike. They're very helpful at various points in this project. And congratulations to all of you. And thank you to the people of Cuba. Thank you to the internationalists who really showed up, who walked the walk for Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nagash, and congratulations on your Thomas Sapporo Award. That is such a beautiful honor. And we bring up my co-chair to introduce some of the other panelists. And we're close here in this afternoon, so please keep your remarks as brief as humanly possible at this hour. And yeah, let's continue the program.
Hi, my name is Khadija.
Hear you.
Hi, my name is Khadija. I really don't talk. My name is Khadija. I'm here co-chairing with my comrade T. I'm an organizer of the Communist League, Communist Party, and a tenant organizer. And I'm here today to introduce one of the greatest seminal professors. She is an adjunct professor at City University, CUNY Center for Worker Education. She has honored her community, numerous community involvements and occasions, and was a recipient of the prestigious Claudia Jones Fellow in the African Study Program at Florida International University. I'm going to introduce use rosemary.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much. It was great seeing Kenya online and Yuri, and it's just wonderful being here today and all of you. Okay, I'm supposed to be really brief, so really gonna try to do a historical journey, and I'm gonna try to do it and be as succinct as I can. I'm supposed to talk about the African American and the African diaspora connection with Cuba. And so, and I want to start out by saying that African peoples in the United States and in the diaspora have had a long history of interacting with Cuba. And that interaction has always been a part of our African diaspora. And it was a commonality, as Yuri mentioned. It was forged by the transatlantic enslavement process, the settled colonial experience, and the history of resisting US imperialism, the master narrative of hegemony. Both peoples know that the struggle against racism, class exploitation, and oppression can never be eliminated, and freedom can never be won by participating or collaborating with the United States and its imperialist vultures. So the history of solidarity of African peoples with the people of Cuba, as it has been said, was forged in the wake of what's known in Cuban history and should be in our history as the conspiracy of the ladder. That was a 19th century slave rebellion in Cuba, so named for the structure that those accused of participating in the conspiracy were then hung up this ladder and tortured. We're talking about 1843. The enslaved Africans in Cuba reportedly twice rose up, even after that, against their enslavement. And by the end of the year, the Spanish authorities believed that the uprisings were part of a vast conspiracy that even stretched right into the African diaspora and here in the United States, that they start linking those urban and rural areas kind of like with a global diasporic connection. So we're talking now by June of 1844, when Gabriel de la Concepcion, who was also known as Placido, along with 10 others in June of 1844, for participating in this alleged conspiracy. Placido was a free person of color. He was a poet and an abolitionist. And the tribute to Placido was actually published in all of the African-American newspapers in this country from the mid-19th centuries well into the late 1950s. And for those of you who know your African-American history, Martin Delaney named one of his children Placido. So the conspiracy of the latter was then followed in a tradition of opposition, and it impacted rebellions in this country against enslavement. So less than a century after that, Frederick Douglass, Martin Delaney, and other African Americans voiced consistently led opposition by demonstrating their solidarity with Cuba in the fight for abolition of slavery and independence from Spain. So in 1851, entitled Cuba and the United States, Frederick Douglass starts with this clarity. He said, "Our voracious eagle is whetting its talons for the capture of Cuba," end of quote. So in the wake of the Civil War, Frederick Douglass encouraged African American youth. Frederick Douglass encouraged African American youth to go to Cuba and join the anti-slavery patriots fighting for the 10 years war for independence. How do you like that? Right. It's an echo to us right here in the United States, same thing. So moving right along.
All right.
15th Amendment, I'm jumping y'all, follow me. The goals of the campaign was to gather as many signatures as possible and present them to President Ulysses Grant, who had publicly denounced Spain's conduct during the war, and to Congress. So along with all these petitions, Black activists also engaged in the campaign for the passage of the resolution in states legislature in support of Cuba, their independence, for forwarding to Grant. Black state legislators Black state legislators and Black voters were key to passing of such resolution in South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. For example, in 1869, Robert Ellis, a Black state legislator from former Union Army veteran, he introduced a resolution in the South Carolina Assembly that basically called on that assembly that they resolved to support the Cuban people in their struggle for independence. Fast forward. In December 1872, there was a founding convention, Cuban Anti-Slavery Committee, and that was held right here in New York, Cuba Square, where the keynote speaker was given by Henry Harlan Garnett. And while Garnett was speaking, the Spanish government attempted to disrupt that educational campaign that was going on, and the people just stood up and they screamed and they yelled the anti-Cubans out of there, or those who were opposed to liberation for Cuba. Then, of course, we jump into 1898, that famous Maine, you know, the ship Maine, for those of you who know about that, the United States government, USS Maine, had been sent to Havana in 1879, supposedly to protect American citizens. Remember Grenada, supposedly protecting American citizens? So 200 Americans, 2 African Americans were killed in that explosion. Although the explosion was and still is said by some to have been caused by a Spanish attack, many believe that it was an accident, but it was used as a pretext or excuse for the United States intervention. The war was yet another step in the building of the American empire. Some African Americans unfortunately, during the 60s, at one period, that is before the time of the success of the revolution, supported the Batista regime. But with the success of the Cuban Revolution, however, quickly inspired African American activists were hailing, and this was in the Black press, support for the Cuban Revolution. Now, the United States as a leader in April of 1959 at the invitation of the American Society of Newspaper Editors. Eisenhower refused to meet him, and Tricky Dick was the one that they sent to shake hands, and that became like a photo op. But during his visit, Fidel, among other places, went to the Lincoln Memorial where he read the Fidel read the Gettysburg Address aloud. And at Penn Station, he was surrounded by an estimate 20,000 people, including many African Americans. So in New York City, he was given the key to the city by Mayor Robert Wagner at that time. And then he went to the Bronx Zoo and on up to Boston. So shortly after Fidel's visit, a newspaper man named Robert Tabor and Richard Gibson, who was one of the founders of an organization called Fair Play for Cuba Committee. They posted a full-page ad in the New York Times. And interesting enough, that ad was just incredible. And people like John Henry Clark, James Baldwin, Julian Mayfield, John O. Killens, Robert F. Williams, all those Black folk, they signed off on that, supported that press, which was published in the press. And then, interesting enough, this Fair Play for Cuba Committee, guess where their headquarters were? Right in the middle of Harlem, right in the middle of Harlem. And the goal of the organization was to speak the truth about the revolution and to promote a good neighbor policy. Now we jump to the summer of 1960. A number of Black activists went to Cuba with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And there is in my book, Fidel and Malcolm X, you can see the signatures of all those Black activists who signed off on that declaration. I won't go into naming their names, but that was a very important meeting that these Black activists had in Cuba because they were a part of the first July 26th celebration. Critical moment, a very critical moment. We're going to now go on to 1960, when Malcolm X went to the Hotel Teresa to meet Fidel. You can see that this history that I've just shared with you, just some of it, it did not begin in 1960. It was a continuum of our history and our solidarity with the peoples of Cuba. And I've laid out to you how that history was forged in the transatlantic slave trade. But it was critically important when Malcolm met Fidel, because when they met upstairs in that floor at the Hotel Teresa, Malcolm said to him, "You have done everything in your country that we need to do here."
Right.
And those words echo in our minds and in our hearts today. And that's why when in 1990, when the Fidel and Malcolm seminar was held in Havana, it was just a continuation of those historical moments. And that continuation is still here today. Free Angela Davis, support that she got. Many of us went to Cuba when Shaka Sankofa scheduled to be placed in the electric chair. Many of you don't know that history. You need to check who he was. Umi Abdul Jamal. We know. Yes, 2 minutes, got it. It's hard for historians to speak so quickly. I hope you got the gist.
Got it.
I just want to say, I like to close this off. You can read my book and you can find out more about the central significance of that history. Then you find Lucas Walker, IFCO Pastors for Peace, the Continuum, the young people who are going, the work, my ability to be able to teach at the University of Havana with young students, incredible. But you know, there's something that's really important that I'm going to close out on. When Wynton Marsalis brought the Lincoln Center Band to Cuba in 2011, in an interview with Marley Safer, Wynton had to explain to Marley what he meant when he referred that he was visiting his cousins. You go to Cuba, Marcellus said, it's like you're with your cousins. You're in the same backyard, raising ice in the drum music. And African-American sister historian Lisa Brock instructs, quote, Cuba provides the blueprint or the basis for a better understanding of the key issues facing contemporary Black Americans and present-day Cuban relations. So in the time allotted, I want to thank you for coming. And there is this glorious history and the reason why we forge on, and that we cannot stop at this point. We must move forward because these lessons are relevant for the struggle in both countries in developing new forms of solidarity efforts between Cuba's African-American descendants and African-Americans in here and in the diaspora.
Amen.
That was
Sir, your friend?
Thank you so very much. I'm so grateful to call you friend, call you mentor. Thank you for sharing your remarks with us, and yeah, just encouraging us to keep up the good fight, especially for our people across the diaspora.
That history is very much needed. Next, I want to present that has long-standing seminal work. He is a professor of political science and African studies at the University of Minnesota, USA, and the author of Marxist Engels' Contribution to Democratic Breakthrough in 2000, and Marx and Race in America in 2000, and the acclaimed two-volume Lenin's Electoral Strategy with Paul Graves Dillon, none other than the incredible August Beach.
Thank you very much, Khadija. Really appreciate this. This is a real honor to be on this panel. Nagash, who I met many years ago, Kenya Serrano, and she came and spoke at in the United States in 1996. A very young Kenya Serrano stood up to the right wing in Miami. That was a real gallant effort on her part. So yes, and what Rosemary just said, can I tag on to some of the things you said? I'm from New Orleans. Originally. Okay. And a lot of historical connect. That's why I went to Marcellus. When Marcellus is from New Orleans, so yeah, when I'm in Havana, I feel I'm in New Orleans. Yeah, that's the way it looks. It looks to me. 1898, with the death of Maceo, had a big impact on the African American community in St. Paul, Minnesota. The African American community actually staged an opera dedicated to the memory of Antonio Maceo. His name became a popular African American boy's name. He became known and pronounced Maceo. That's where Maceo comes from. Antonio Maceo. Yes. So it was connections are there, and Rosemary is exactly correct. On the Malcolm X Fidel meeting, Rosemary, I come back and reading your book. There's a moment in your book that I think is really important. It's that discussion that Malcolm has with one of the members, a Black member of Fidel's delegation, about the color question. Can a white person be a revolutionary or not? It's an interesting discussion that Malcolm has with him, and I think it had a long-term impact on Malcolm. And you could see Malcolm wanted that meeting. He was feeling the narrowness of the Nation of Islam, and Malcolm was always reaching out for new forces and so on. He actually got disciplined by the Nation of Islam, by Elijah Muhammad, for having that meeting with Malcolm X. But I think that meeting was anticipatory of Malcolm's trajectory. And that's something else I think that we should also acknowledge. As I said, I'm from New Orleans. In 1959, I was in senior in high school when the revolution happened. It had a big impact. I was already in love with Cuba before the revolution. One of my favorite boxers, Kid Gavilan, was from Cuba. One of my favorite musicians, Perez Prado. And so I was already sort of when the revolution happened, it seemed to me, it was the icing on the cake in many ways. Especially, I'm on the picket lines, trying to desegregate lunch counters in New Orleans, and then I read about how segregation was implemented by the revolution. That had a big impact on me. Fast forward to Africa, I lived in Tanzania between 1969 and 1971. And it was really there that I began to learn about the impact of how Africans saw the Cuban Revolution. Tanzania was sort of the headquarters of the Southern African Liberation Movement. All of the major movements had their headquarters in Tanzania. So I had a chance to mix it up with African revolutionaries. It was there I really learned the deep respect that the African revolutionary movement had for the Cuban Revolution. I remember a conversation with Walter Rodney in defense of the Cuban Revolution. So when I came back to the United States after that visit, that really put me on my path to looking for revolutionary politics. Fast forward to 1990 with the Sandinista elections and the defeat of the Sandinistas, and many of us began to realize that we needed to defend Cuba because the crowd in Miami and elsewhere was saying Cuba is next. And so we began organizing what in many ways were organizations that led to the creation of the National Network on Cuba. We organized our Minnesota Cuba Committee began in 1990 in response to the elections, the defeat of the Sandinistas, and organizing in order to defend the Cuban Revolution. I think as far as the African American community is concerned, I think there are all kinds of opportunities and ways in which we can defend the Cuban Revolution, promote the Cuban Revolution, and that's what I tried to do. In 2005 with Hurricane Katrina, that was an opportunity, I think, to really talk about the difference between two kinds of societies. And it was fascinating because in that summer with Katrina, there were other hurricanes that summer through the Gulf of Mexico and so. And two of them were much stronger than Katrina. at that summer. And no more than maybe about 10 to 15 people died in hurricanes that summer in 2005. And as you know, what happened in New Orleans when 1,800 people at least lost their lives. People are still losing their lives, by the way, in terms of all kinds of issues, mental issues and so on, coming out of what happened in Hurricane Katrina. And the 1,600 doctors who volunteered to go to Cuba to help with the aftermath of Katrina, which was denied by the Bush administration. It was criminal on their behavior. But I thought it was an important opportunity to see this as a teaching moment. What happened? You have two societies that are struck by a natural disaster, and how do they respond to this natural disaster? And the differences were stark and instructive. What happens when working people take political power for the first time? Fast forward to 2020, the George Floyd murder. Thought this was another important opportunity, a teaching moment. Especially the claim coming out of certain projects like the 1619 project, the New York Times, the claim that if you want to understand societies like the United States, you got to go back to the slavery. It all begins with slavery. Well, if that's true, we have three countries in the Western Hemisphere that all had racial slavery. Two of them had racial slavery longer than the United States. Racial slavery begins in Cuba longer and lasts longer. In 1884 is when racial slavery is officially ended in Cuba. And then there's also Brazil. So you've got these three societies and so on. And what happens when, how do the police behave in these three different societies? And it seems to me the evidence is very clear. But what a difference a revolution makes. A person of African origin, visible African roots, has a higher probability of dying in a police encounter in the United States and in Brazil than is the case in Cuba. Probability that you will come out of that encounter losing your life is qualitatively higher first in Brazil, next in the United States, and not in Cuba. And so how do we explain that difference? How do we explain that difference? And the difference to me, it makes clear that just because a society has had racial slavery, it's not inevitable. Just because a society has had racial slavery, it's not inevitable that outcome of the behavior of the police. What happened in 1955, on January 1st, 1955, the general strike that took place on January 1st, 1959. That's when the police, for the first time, came under the control of the population as a whole. They didn't burn down police stations, they took them over and made the police, for the first time, actually subservient to the need to the Cuban people. That's how you want to talk about police reform. Go to Cuba. Go to Cuba and see what reforming the police actually looks like. It explains, again, I think it goes a long way in explaining why it is that you have a higher probability of coming out of a police encounter in the United States, losing your life if you are visibly of African roots, than is the case in Cuba or Brazil. Is a whole nother story. That's a whole nother story. Yeah, but the lessons of the police. And the lessons of what happens when working people actually take control of the government. There's more I'd like to say, but I see my be under discipline. Just wanted to say what I can't pull it up, don't have time to pull it up. There's a great on Cuba's contribution to the African Revolution. There's another side of it too, that the Cubans acknowledge. And there was a speech that Raul Castro gave on May 27, 1991, in which the last Cuban troops were coming back from Angola. And in that speech there, Raul Castro describes the impact that Angola had on Cuba. And this is 1991. This is about the time the Soviet Union has collapsed. It's not clear what's going to happen in Cuba. And in that speech is very prophetic. Raul Castro says that what Cuba was able to do in Angola will be of benefit to Cuba. Cuba, he says, Angola saves us. Angola saves the Cuban Revolution. First of all, he quotes Fidel Castro saying, if a people can't defend other people, you can't defend yourself. And that's what the Cuban Revolution was, that contribution of the African Revolution, Angola especially, in helping to explain why the Cuban Revolution is still intact and why it is that we need to do everything we can to defend it.
Who's there? I think if you're there, you can turn on your video.
Thank you so very much. Dr. Nims. So grateful for this history and just being able to sit at the feet of wisdom. So are appreciated, know that in this space. So our last speaker, I want to introduce a very special person of our Caribbean family, joining us on live stream, and thank you for being so patient with us today. we were running behind a little bit this morning, so, and thank you for closing us out today. Okay. So Isaac Saney is the author of a new book, and he's going to talk a little bit about that book. And I think we are like 4:15 here in New York. I want to make sure that he's able to share as much remarks about his new book and able to talk about the connection of the Caribbean and Cuba today. So I want to welcome Isaac Saney.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and especially to see so many people gathering, both physically, in person, and online in the struggle to make sure that Cuba is not only overcomes this ongoing economic war and unceasing aggression from the United States, but its example continues to be shown to the world, to be known to the world, so that we can build a better world. I want to build on this theme that we've been talking about, Cuba and Africa. And of course, Cuba is situated in the Caribbean. Of course, Cuba has played a very significant role in the Caribbean, particularly as recognized by the Caribbean community. I just finished, my book just recently came out, Cuba, Africa, and Apartheid's End, Africa's Children Return. And in essence, this book is a tribute to the hundreds of thousands of Cubans who served in their international missions, especially in Southern Africa. As has already been said by the Cuban ambassador and others, which I don't need to go into, Cuba played a central role in the anti-colonial and national liberation struggles in Southern Africa, delivering the decisive blow that accelerated the demise of apartheid. My book goes into significant detail about the Battle of Quito Cuanavalle and the impacts, not only in terms of leading to Namibia's independence, which had been illegally occupied by South Africa, but also looks at the impact inside South Africa itself. Now, I think it's important to understand that the Cubans could tell this story best themselves. There are a number of scholars outside of Cuba, Pero Glacius, for example, Horace Campbell, and others, myself included, who have told the story, because Cuba, of course, is involved in this incessant day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute struggle with the empire, right? And of course, Cubans have a very strong streak of humility, of being humble, as Fidel Castro said when the socialist character of the revolution was declared in April of 1961, the revolution of the humble, for the humble, by the humble, right? So Cuba is not a country that often blows its own horn, so to speak, in terms of glorifying what it has done in terms of its solidarity and social love it has demonstrated to the world. But Cuba played a decisive role in the apartheid in South Africa. The defeat of the racist South African armed forces in Angola fundamentally altered the regional balance of forces, resulting in the independence of Namibia, as I said, and directly leading to disintegration of the racist apartheid regime in South Africa. It bears underscoring, and I think this is important, that the fight to liberate South Africa took place both inside and outside its borders. Indeed, much greater numbers of people, tens if not hundreds of thousands more, died outside South Africa than inside South Africa. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa concluded that the number of people killed inside the borders of the country in the course of the liberation struggle was considerably lower than those who died outside. And I think when we think of history and historical memory, I think it's important to understand this. The survival of the racist South African state depended on establishing its domination of all of Southern Africa. And towards this end, Pretoria militarized the South African state and fashioned it into a sword to defend the racist system, the system of white supremacy, and wage a regional war of terror. From 1975 to 1988, and this is only recent history, the South African armed forces embarked on a campaign of massive destabilization of the region. The war of destabilization wrought a terrible toll. The financial and human costs can only be measured in direct damage, cannot only be measured in direct damage and deaths, but also in the premature deaths and projected economic loss caused by the destruction of infrastructure, agriculture, and power networks. This war only came to an end when you look at the Battle of Cuba-Cuba 87-88, and the outmaneuvering of the South African forces in Namibia, where Cuba outflanked them to the west. This is only fairly recent history, yet nobody ever talks about this in main discourse or talks about the lasting legacy and impact. So while it is difficult to estimate the economic cost and damage, it was undoubtedly enormous. One study calculates that up to 1988, the total economic cost for those South African states who were called the frontline states was in the excess of $45 billion at that time. For Angola, something like $22 billion, Mozambique, $12 billion, Zambia, $7 billion, Zimbabwe, $3 billion. In terms of human cost, between 1981 and 1988 alone, an estimated 1.5 million people were directly, indirectly killed because of South Africa's actions, including 825,000 children, right? And of course, many of us are familiar with the notorious May 4th, 1978 Kasinga massacre, when Namibian refugees located in that town, Kasinga in southwestern Angola, were attacked by a South African air and paratrooper attack, killing thousands of people, and where also dozens, if not hundreds of people were taken prisoner. I've interviewed actually South African soldiers who participated in these attacks, and a general who was then a captain who participated in these attacks. I mean, clearly acts of terror. And of course, I think this whole situation can best be summed up by the late Julius Nyerere, the Walimo of Tanzania, who basically said in 1986, when he was president of when is war not war? Apparently when it's waged by the stronger against the weaker as a preemptive strike. When is terrorism not terrorism? Apparently when it is committed by a more powerful government against those at home and abroad who are weaker than itself and whom it regards as a potential threat or even as a insufficiently supportive of its own objectives. Those are the only conclusions one can draw in the light of the current widespread condemnation of aggression and terrorism, side by side with the ability of certain nations, he's talking here about South Africa, to attack others with impunity and to organize murder, kidnapping, and massive destruction with the support of some permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. South Africa is such a country. And of course, the members of the Security Council include the United States, who basically saw South Africa as an outpost of Western civilization. Given the time limits, I won't talk about the Battle of Cuba, but it was a decisive engagement, and I talk about detail in my book, but the Cubans have produced numerous memoirs about the Cuba, but it was a decisive turning point. And it's important today because it demonstrates that white supremacy can be defeated, right? That the invincible edifice of racial rule can be laid low, can be, as I said, defeated, and so on. And that's what Cuba demonstrated, right? In its mission that began in 1975 as Operation Carlotta, named after an enslaved African woman who on November 5th, 1843, launched a rebellion, to when it culminated with the return of Cubans back to the island nation in the early 90s in 1991. So Cuba demonstrated this. And what's important about this, why it's incredibly important at our time, okay, is that Cuba decided to valorize African lives, right? Cuba is the only country on the world stage, the government, which clearly articulates outside of Africa the value of Africans, particularly in the Western Hemisphere. In fact, Cuba painted its mission in Africa, okay, as a direct contribution to not only its deep historical connections to Africa, what Rose Mealy and others have spoken about, but also specifically because of a debt owed to Africa itself. Okay, in fact, the late Jorge Risket, who was Cuba's leading diplomat in Africa, in a conference in 2012 honoring the great Pan-Africanist Kwame Nkrumah, stated, quote, this was the understanding with which Cuban fighters came to the ancestral Africa to fight side by side with the people against colonialism and the oppressive apartheid state. Okay, and he talked about this, that there was a debt owed to Africa. It's important to understand that Fidel Castro, I think, was the first person in a Latin American country to talk about Cuba being a Latin and African country. And that in a sense, he told Amílcar Cabral in the 60s that Cuba is Africa, Africa is Cuba. This was after Cabral talked about the fact that while he may not believe in life after death, he knows that if it does exist, Africa's ancestors are looking down, celebrating and commemorating and being moved by the fact that Africa's children, those who were once taken as slaves, have now returned their descendants to participate in Africa's liberation struggles. And of course, while the circumstances may have changed, Cuba's solidarity in Africa continues. Cuba has made a critical contribution to the fight against the Ebola epidemic in the West African nations of Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. Cuba sent the largest medical contingent, right? And he stood side by side with the peoples of West Africa as they combated this terrible scourge. As the Cuban representative, Ambassador to Liberia, declared, we cannot see our brothers from Africa in difficult times and remain there with our arms folded. At the September 16, 2014 meeting of the United Nations Security Council, Cuba's representative declared, humanity has a debt to African people. We cannot let them down. And this theme of a debt to Africa, of a profound historical connection to Africa, is something that runs not only from the leadership, but right down through Cuban society. And we see that reflected in the fact that Cuba is one of the strongest supporters of the Caribbean community's reparations lawsuit against Britain, France, and other nations in Western Europe who participated, profited it, and grew wealthy and gained power from the transatlantic slave trade. Cuba has been a consistent and powerful voice supporting the reparations movement. The 2001 United Nations World Conference Against Racism, Xenophobia, and Other Related Intolerance was mentioned earlier by one of the presenters. I encourage people, young people, to study this conference because at the time it was taking place in August and early September of 2001, it was a major international event where the West was defeated on the issue of reparations. And in fact, they walked out. The United States walked out, Britain walked out, and so forth. It was a major victory. And Fidel Castro's speech at that conference was one of the quintessential highlights. Of course, 9/11 happened. The attack that happened on the Twin Towers, it changed geopolitics, and that conference was pushed to the sideline. But once again, the reparations movement is gaining steam, and the Caribbean community is pushing that forward. In conclusion, I think, why is this history important? Others have written about it. I have gone into it in detail. I don't obviously have time, given our time constraint, to go into greater detail about why Cuba became involved in Africa, how they became involved, the details of the Battle of Quito Cuanaval, how they strategically outmaneuvered the South Africans, and how this had political repercussions inside the South African apartheid regime among white South Africans and Black South Africans, and accelerated the end of apartheid. It was the critical factor within a constellation of other developments that pushed the end of apartheid forward. As Nelson Mandela said, the Cuba made a significant contribution, right? Because of its selfless character. And in conclusion, I'd like to say, Cuba is often described as the only foreign country to have gone to Africa and gone away with nothing but the coffins of its sons and daughters who died in the struggles to liberate Africa. Cuba's role in Southern Africa illustrates the division between those who fight for the cause of freedom, liberation, and justice, to repel invaders and colonialists, and those who fight against just causes, those who wage war to occupy, colonize, and oppression. The island's internationalist missions in Africa are a profound challenge to those who argue that relations amongst the world's nations and peoples are and can only be determined by self-interest and the pursuit of power and wealth. Cuba provides the example that it is possible to build relations based on genuine solidarity and social love, demonstrating the alternatives which permit people to realize their deepest aspirations and that another, better world is possible. Thank you.
Isaac, I don't know if you could hear me. I was yelling. But I appreciate you. Yeah, because we were like running out of time because we have afternoon workshops. But we thank you so much for your remarks and that.
And people can perhaps buy, there's Periglahasis' work, Horace Campbell's work. My book has just come out. I think it's and Rose Millie's work on African-American connections. I think people should read all of those works and do their own research and build their own histories as well.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for hanging in there with us this afternoon. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for standing in solidarity with our Cuban brothers and sisters. Cuba sí. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon and thank you for joining.